Hello and welcome to the podcast series Carewell Conversations, raising awareness about the issues and challenges facing family carers who combine work and care by engaging with employers, HR professionals, employee representative organisations, family carers and the research community. My name is Brian Doyle. I'm the podcast series producer and a researcher with the Carewell Project, a collaboration between University College Dublin and Family Carers Ireland, funded by the Health Research Board. The overall aim of the Carewell Research Project is to promote health and self-care among working family carers. And over the course of this podcast series, we will have conversations with those who have a role to play in supporting working family carers and begin to tease out the challenges and issues facing them and their employers.
Hi, my name is Doreen Mucheru, Acting Project Manager of Carewell, and today I'm joined in conversation by Kathleen Lynch, who is both an academic and activist. She's the author of the book Care and Capitalism, and in discussion we explore some of the themes highlighted in her book and how they affect employed caregivers.
Thanks, Kathleen, for agreeing to do this podcast with us. And we'll start by speaking about how you developed a passion for care. Obviously, this is a theme that, features strongly in your work as an author and activist. How did you develop an interest in care?
Well, I think there were a number of factors that contributed. I probably came initially at it through the concept of equality, because in establishing equality studies in UCD, there was a very dominant view about what was equality and what concept of justice actually applied. That it was about economic equality and political representation and recognition of differences, which are hugely important. But I always felt there was something missing. And I felt that somehow the relational life of people, the relations that people had, and the way in which they nurture and create one another through their relationships in many places, at work, at home, and family, and outside of it, wasn't really part of that framework of thinking. Because you see, in political theory and in the social sciences generally, care was seen as a problem of ethics, not a problem of justice, not seen to be a justice problem. And the reason it was like that, it was this assumption that it came naturally to people. Mm-hmm. Caring was a natural disposition. It was something that came to you. You didn't have to learn it. You could do it spontaneously. And of course, it was assumed it came naturally to women more than men. Mm-hmm. All those assumptions were there. And at the same time, I had worked, I should say. So that was one factor. At the theoretical level, I felt there was something missing in the concept of social justice and equality by not taking account of people's interdependence as human beings, the fact that we all become dependent at some stage of life. And even, at the early stages, we'll all die in infancy without care. And I just felt that there was a misunderstanding of the human condition and that it was not reflected in theories of justice. The experience that I had as probably relevant is when I lived, I suppose, two experiences I had, and many, I suppose, personal or more family and personal. One is I saw a lot of people who lived without care, I suppose I put it that way, and the effects of that on them. Not just poverty, because I lived when I was a student in my final year in college in a children's home. And that was a very formative influence on me in the sense that the children were in state care. I have to say they were well cared for. It was a very happy place. But I was very conscious of some of the children, although the families were not well off. It wasn't just poverty that there was the issue. There was also a care deprivation in their primary care lives, in many cases suffering from abuse and violence and neglect, and for all kinds of political reasons, not blaming their families, but many reasons. And then after I graduated, I also worked in a hostel. I was a house mother after I did my master's degree for 2 years for homeless teenage girls. Mm-hmm. Although I always saw it as a class issue, and it was certainly homelessness was a class issue. But there was also the people who survived and who got out of it and those who didn't. Often the defining line was what their own nurturing had been and who and if they had nurturing in their lives. I always felt that there was something, for some people, their mental health was so damaged by their abuse and lack of care. For others, less so, or they had a good teacher, or they had a family member, a granny or an aunt or a cousin or a neighbor who looked after them. So that was another. So that was much more personal. When we wrote Equality from Theory to Action, we wrote a book about equality, and for the first time, I proposed this idea of affective equality as a dimension. And it arose from discussions we had with community groups, a lot of women's groups who kept on saying, oh, redistribution, recognition, parity of representation, that's not enough. We are carers, we do an awful lot of caring, and that's not named in your theory of justice. So I think they had a huge influence on me, the gender dimension of caring.
Okay. I know you speak about caring quite broadly, but in simple terms, for an outsider coming in, how would we define this term, just so that we gain a deeper understanding?
Well, I think caring is, human beings are self-interested, but they're not entirely self-interested. Martha or Joan Tronto has written about what she calls Homo curans, C-U-R-A-N-S, which is a caring person. And it goes back to ancient writing about the fact that the human condition is instinctively cooperative, because survival depends on care. Survival of the human condition, long-term care of the environment, species, care of one another, care of the people we work with, our families, but much more than that, our neighbours. So I always felt that if you could work cooperatively with people, you could achieve an awful lot. And to care was a very helpful principle to underpin that work. I mean, the concept of care, I felt, could be aligned with the concept of justice, because none of us, we're all interdependent. There's no human being who doesn't rely on some other human being in this world in some way, even to provide the electricity or whatever it is that they need. Sometimes their food, their shoes, their clothes. We are not independent. And I think for me, caring is about recognizing the interdependency of the human condition, and it's the high dependency. We are very dependent on others if we're ill, vulnerable, very old, sick, or when we're young, very young children. So it's endemic to the human condition. And I felt that the idea that this was something that came naturally and easily without any thought or work was very naive, because there are good ways to care. And care exists in a continuum from sublime, love, care, and solidarity at the level of the nation state or the global order to abuse, neglect, and violence. So it is a continuum from carefulness to carelessness and abuse and violence. So, and as you know, and I have written about, there are different forms of care and different contexts in which it happens. It happens in the primary care sphere, the family, but it happens outside of that. It's hugely, like if you think of secondary care, what we call secondary care relations, which are not as important, but are very important, like in schools, in welfare, in healthcare. And if you take even the word healthcare, what astounds me, I suppose, at times is I don't think there's any lecture program, and I've often said I'd be willing to contribute if you started. I'd be very happy to contribute on care, yet about healthcare. So it is very fundamental to our public services, to housing, to health, to welfare, to education. Educare, in education, the Latin root of the word of education is to nurture. And and then of course at the level of the nation state and beyond, we have solidarity. We express with unknown others. We do it through donations. We do it through activism. But even in work organizations, I would have to say, when workplaces can be very caring or they can be very careless. And unfortunately, large bureaucracies are often quite careless because they don't take account of the needs of people and they follow rules rather than taking account of human need. So I would see it as an amalgam of activities that involve nurturing, from the flower, the plant, the potato that you grow, up to and including our care of the environment.
Okay. Thank you for that definition. And I certainly think that your work provides, intellectual language to the concept of care. And I had the privilege of going through your book, Care and Capitalism. And here you highlight the concept of the capitalist-centric thinking and care-centric thinking. How would you define these terms, and what are the the key differences between these modes of thinking?
Well, as I said in that book and other articles I've written, neoliberal capitalism, which is new liberalism, and new liberal forms of capitalism, are built around the idea of productivity, gain, and profit making. And thinking that is built on those principles tends to prioritize instrumental goals of making money, building a career at the cost of caring for other people. And that is what a capitalocentric thinking is. It's where, even if you take European policy at a very important level, human capital, the development of what's called human capital, is the core principle of most European thinking and most national policy making, actually, in our own country and across Europe. And it's about preparing people for the labour market, and it's about doing what it says on the tin, which is making people into human capital to make money, to run business. I'm not saying we don't need to develop technical and capacities and competencies. We most certainly do. But the very way in which the human is reduced to a form of capital says an awful lot about how education has mutated from its concern with the whole person to being primarily concerned with the economic actor in the labour market. So I would say the care-centric thinking is about learning to think with care. Let's say it's a way in which we actually think, how can I do good in the world each day? How can I make the world a better place? Those who are near me, those who are not so near me, those I work with, those who are in my local community, my neighbours. How can I make the world a better place? It's a disposition, a way of thinking. Go out into the world and you try and create cooperativeness and collaboration. And I'm not saying that because it's very difficult to cooperate and collaborate with people whom you disagree with. And there's a lot of negotiation, a lot of tension. It's not simple, but it is a different mindset, completely different mindset. And I suppose what I've argued in Care and Capitalism is that the way in which, for example, the principle of competition is written into everything that we do in society. Take the universities. When I first went to the universities, the departments work with one another, often in joint degree programs and everything else. And there was a lot of collaboration. And what happened was the private market and the profit-making principle, although it wasn't about profit, but it was about competition, was entered into public institutions. And we would compete with other departments for the same project, for example, fundraising. And I used to think this was insane. But the whole principle of competition was made into a virtue. Just to have competition was virtuous. But it isn't virtuous. Sometimes there is competition in life. There's scarce resources on this earth, and we all have limited time. So those are ontological realities. We have a finite life. They're all realities. But making competition into a virtue whereby competing, what I would say, for its own sake, became institutionalized, and with it a mindset whereby everybody is rewarded for successfully competing, often against their next door neighbor or even their colleague in the same department. And that is extremely divisive. I don't know that it produces great outcomes, because everybody is always trying to win, trying to outcompete others, trying to get a better grant, trying to get more prestige, more power, more recognition, often for the sake of it, no more than that, because the ranking and rewarding of that in the university is based on that kind of principle. I think it's very destructive, very, very destructive.
And what do you foresee as some of the challenges that could, come upon society should we continue with the capitalocentric way of thinking, especially, with the rise of working carers and their need in society?
Yeah. Well, you see, the problem for carers who are working is if you go back to where I was at the very beginning in relation to this, care is not citizenship defining work. That's not just true of capitalism. That has been true back into the Middle Ages. And that's very important to remember. And I think you're going to ask me later on about liberalism, so I'll maybe discuss that later on. But to come to the idea of care is not seen as citizenship defining work. And because it's not, then people who do care or have care responsibilities are actually are invisible. Because when you come to work, you're seen to be this autonomous worker who is independent, has no care responsibilities, and You're not meant to speak about it. Foucault talked about things that are taboo, things that are unspoken, and things that are silenced. In a sense, care is all those things. It is not respectable. Though it has become kind of respectable for men, maybe to admit it, that they have care, it's certainly no longer respectable it wasn't for a very long time anyway, to say, I have to go and collect the children. I have to look after my mother. My mother is ill. I have to take time off. I can't publish another article, etc. And really, there isn't a full recognition of the fact that most people, not everybody, have care responsibilities for somebody or something. They have, or maybe another creature, maybe even their pets, who have also to be looked after if you have made them your pets. So I think that point of view, there is a whole way of thinking that is very hard for people who have high dependency care responsibilities, because you are working often 24 hours a day, especially if you work at night, and I think that is not appreciated. Our work environment, our paid work environment, assumes that you're not like that. It basically assumes you don't have care responsibility. There's carers leave, but it's not that well paid. And certainly if you're to take it, it won't compensate for your employment, then it's means tested. There are many, many problems. And for people should be allowed to get leave and get proper payment for it, because that is often what they want to do, and they need respite as well. And that, of course, you can't be working all the time, including working and caring all the time. It's exhausting. It's a big, big issue for corporations. It's the principles of not just capitalism, because it goes back deeper than that care doesn't matter, and that can be done on the side. But it doesn't take time. Care is hugely tiring work, emotionally, mentally, physically, and of course, there's often a lot of conflict if there are family carers, as you know. Who will care for my mother, my sister who's ill, who's going to take her at home, who's going to organize the care? Those are all major areas of conflict and tension and work for somebody who actually are the people who have to do it. And I think work environments do not fully appreciate that.
Okay. And what are some of the solutions you would propose for the workplace to take into consideration working carers, but in general, the concept of care?
Well, I think a very different world to the world we live in. So I would prefer, I've always argued, for example, and this is completely seems very removed from care, but I firmly believe in cooperative work, cooperatives as an alternative. And we've very few of those in Ireland. We've very few businesses that are built, we'd say, on the Mondragon model, like they have in the Basque region, where you have 89,000 people employed in cooperatives, worker-owner cooperatives. It has an investment in a company or a welfare agency or anything where everybody is an owner as well as a worker. I really do believe that, very strongly. And I think that we in Ireland, we only think in terms of new businesses, in terms of capitalist business. How can you make money? How can you make money fast? Laud and praise all those people who make a lot of money. It's fine, it's grand. I don't resent them or anything. I don't feel that way. But what I do think, if we want sustainable development, and if we want sustainable development throughout the world, we have to think of business in a very different way. We have to think of working cooperatively, building up an we don't even have, I gave a presentation in 2012 along with Stevie Nolan from Belfast to the joint, the Committee on Enterprise and Trade and Employment, I think it was, the Joint Directors Committee. And we prepared a paper on the desirability of having not the only form of employment, but worker-owner cooperatives set up all over the country to actually, because the whole idea is all the money that's made is invested locally as well. That's another very strong principle. And you can't sell your shares and or hold on to them if you're not working there. You can't be, as it were, a free rider on other people's labour. You have to actually be a worker to retain. And I think that idea of building up an economy and building industry and employment around worker cooperatives, it would require a major re-education, going back to what I said earlier on. Such capitalist-centric thinking. And people have tried cooperatives, I know, in several areas, and many of them haven't worked, but that's partly because we have no education and training in that area. Take the cooperative bank in Canada, Desjardins, And that is now a very large, I think it's the sixth largest cooperative bank sixth largest bank, and it's a cooperative bank in Canada. That began from the credit union movement. But they began a whole re-education program, as they have in Mondragon. Mondragon now has their own university teaching cooperative development. But like, in order to develop that, you have to have the education infrastructure, develop that infrastructure, for example, around a substantial education around cooperative financing, cooperative businesses or anything. In a grand scale, if we sold them off and they became successful. It's like as if we have no other mentality in Ireland. And we have to think of that as another way of being. I'm not saying it's the only way, but it's certainly another way. And I think it gives people engagement, involvement, participation. They find a sense of power. And it's a very different way of working. So that is one thing I would certainly think is desirable to start it and have. In Northern Ireland and in Scotland, they have set up departments in the governments in order to set up cooperative worker-owner enterprises.
Right. So I hear you say that education is a major way to bring about change, especially when it comes to, changing the culture in the workplace. So what about society in general? Would we use the same approach? Would the schools and universities have a role to play?
Yeah, maybe answer the first one. I think it's very fund cooperative movements like movements around care for those who do care. It's very important because if you don't fund those organizations who do that community work, for example, which is really about local care work in local communities, often in less well-off communities, and community development work is part of the care infrastructure of society. So they need it, as do organizations like Care Alliance Ireland and all the family carers and many others. But I think encouraging people to set up again alliances and social movements around care is crucial at a local community level. Running programs through now the local education training boards, whereby we train and educate people around care and how to establish cooperatives and how to move and how to exercise political pressure, because you do need to have a social movement in order to bring about change. Formal education is a huge road, and I wrote about it at 2007, 15 years ago, not today, yesterday. And the absence of any education around care and love, care and solidarity in our schools. We expect people to know how to love one another, to know how to care for one another without giving them any formal education. And I think that is a huge difference. There is a need to learn how to do care well. And not just in schools, though, but in our higher education institutions as well. So the care is like social care, and in social work, the care professions, if you like, are often looked down on as if they don't matter, like they're secondary, like nursing isn't as important as medicine kind of thing. And I think that that's a major mistake because, in fact, it's the care work of society that keeps people alive. It's the care work that keeps us going. Technical skills, but that alone won't keep us going. So I firmly believe in education, but not just formal education. I think you need education through practice.
Okay.
You need placements whereby people learn to think about, where do I exercise care now in my life? Let's say young people, who do I care for? Do I care for anybody? And one of the things I had said in the book, in Care and Capitalism, the last chapter in it in particular, is there is a major problem in our formal education system at the moment. Mostly people are rewarded for their individual achievements. And because of that, we teach people to outcompete others. We don't teach them to cooperate. From the time you go to primary school till if you go to college, you spend your time trying to be the top of the class or the nearest to it as possible. And then we wonder, you go home, you do your own homework, you try to get better grades in the exam than your friend. Everything is about yourself. That kind of what I call capitalist-centric thinking, in the sense that it is very self-centered, doesn't change when you qualify or get your degree or whatever it is you get, your diploma. That is the way you have been taught to think, to outcompete, to win for yourself, not to win for your group, not to achieve something for your community, but to actually largely be successful for yourself. So I believe that assessment should change.
Okay.
Yes, fundamentally, I think there should be much more cooperative assessments. And we have to think how to do that because we don't know how to do it. But we should not only reward people for their private individual achievement.
Okay.
I think what it does, it produces a mentality which says, my own personal achievement is all that matters.
Okay.
That would be very different to the kind of examinations we have at the moment. Very, very different. I know from trying to do it in college in particular, there's a lot of resistance. The students, of course, are not used to doing that. They're not used to working with others and getting the same grade, and they resent it, and they feel then they won't get a 2-1 or a first class degree or whatever. But that is something that box needs to be opened up. And we need to discuss it, because where everything is based on, the I, and I said it's not insignificant that the measure of the I is used for the iPad and the iPhone and everything else. And then we wonder why people aren't thoughtful or wanting to work to look after other people, because they're never awarded to, and they're never educated on how to do it, either technically or even in terms of how they feel.
Okay. So just a slight shift from that. In your work, you point out that neoliberal capitalism is the dominant form of capitalism in the 21st century. And this seems to be in direct opposition to the concept of care, which we're discussing. Do you believe that it's possible for both ways of thinking to coexist in the world we live in?
Oh, they do coexist, is the answer.
Or harmoniously, rather?
But one is very much dominant, over the other. I mean, they coexist, but capitalism has the upper hand, because those with power and money and political influence and cultural influence, those who control the media, social media, they determine the kind of public narrative that there is. And I don't know if you've read the book by Shoshana Zuboff on surveillance capitalism, but it's very interesting because it's about how social media reinforces the mindset that I've been talking about of self-interest, competition, and fear, the fear that goes with it. So I think, yes, do I think that these processes are coexist? They do. Do I think it is desirable that we challenge neoliberalism? Of course I do, because I think it is a political philosophy that has emanated, as we know, from the 1970s, from the Chicago School, and it is based on false assumptions about the human condition. And this, I think, is very important. Based on a kind of Hobbesian view of life, that people are primarily and largely self-interested, and that they are autonomous, and that they are also capable of thinking and acting largely in terms of economic rationality, the Homo sapiens view of the human being. And I'd like to comment on each of those, because this idea that we know the world only through our cognition in abstract sense is very naive. We know the world through feeling. And a lot of what we feel about things is often more true to what is actually instinctually how we feel. But we are superimposed in us a view that we should think competitively, act competitively. And many people don't want to do that. Luciana Lulich, who is L-I-C-H, who was one of my former PhD students, has published a number of articles. I've co-authored a couple of them with her. And it was a study of 4,000 students in higher education. And they're very interesting, because what she found of those students, it was a bigger study, it was actually a bigger response rate, I think, than some of the student surveys. That a lot of students actually, yes, they wanted careers and all, but most of them wanted to have good personal relationships. They did, and they talked about their relational lives and how much they mattered to them. More women, more so than men, but both groups, young people. And she was investigating the idea of kind of the smart economy and how committed young adults in higher education were to it. And they weren't really that committed, is what I'm saying. But they were often not given any other option. They weren't encouraged to think differently and to think caringly about the world, or if they enter their professions, that they should think maybe about serving their own country and society, being funded and paid for, may I say so? Nobody seems to think they have any obligation to pay back the enormous cost of doing medical degrees and nursing degrees in this country. And yet it's an enormous cost to the Irish people, including their own families as well. But there isn't that sense of we have a duty or responsibility to give back as much as to receive. And I think what she found is the students did feel they wanted to give back, but often they weren't encouraged to. I'm not talking about their profession, I'm talking in general. And so I think that is there. And then this idea, I suppose, that people are autonomous, I just think that's such a mistake, because people are vulnerable. Our bodies are vulnerable. You know, if we be knocked down tomorrow, we can get sick. And this idea that we're autonomous and impermeable, impenetrable, that we're not going to be damaged, it's simply not true. And the other thing is that our decisions only affect ourselves. Our decisions don't. Any decision we make has implications for other people, including the people around us. So I'm saying the concept of the person that's underpinning neoliberalism is not a full or accurate concept ontologically. They're relational, and they are all the other things as well, but we are relational beings, and we are created through other people. We co-create one another through our relationships, for good and bad.
Absolutely. No, thank you for that insight. I certainly agree that I suppose I read in your book that altruism or the need to care might not necessarily fall from the sky. It needs to be taught to us. So I do appreciate that. The other point that I feel that came out strongly was the fact that women provide disproportionately more care than men. And how does the understanding of what it means to be a man undermine the work of care in this group?
Well, I think if we go back, Raven Connell has written extensively about this, about how masculinity is defined in our Western society, and indeed in most societies. It's equated with dominance. Masculinity is equated with dominance, and whether that's dominance through getting the more senior post in a department, or getting the most prestigious job, or being the boss in the household, that is the definition of masculinity. And it is ubiquitous. It's in most cultures. There are very, very few exceptions to it. And of course, it's not going to change overnight, and be very naive to think it would. And to care, you see, and to recognize that one is not autonomous, that one is vulnerable, that we depend on other people, is to admit to yourself that you can't be dominant. And that is a way of thinking that is not aligned with masculinity. And I think that that's a huge education task. I don't know how much it's applied now, but there was a very good program in schools some years ago around masculinity, rethinking masculinity. And it was in our Irish schools. I don't know how much it has been enacted or that, but I think it's very important, because a lot of what we know about to be a boy is to be in a powerful position, to dominate women, to dominate other men, to dominate ethnic minorities, to dominate men who are gay if you're heterosexual. That is what it means. And it's, to be always be on the winning side. And of course, humanity itself is always equated with masculinity. If I refer to two recent events, the hurling final, was it Sunday, All Ireland hurling final? Galway I better get it right, Limerick and Kilkenny, or the rugby, where Ireland wins the rugby in New Zealand. And the men are equated with Ireland. We talk about a women's team, but men are the team. Or the ladies' football, which really drives me insane. I think that reflects a whole attitude that man is the measure of humanity, and women are equated in the degree to which they meet the male measure. And men never, if you have a vote in a class in primary school or secondary school, I always remember telling people this, you ask children to vote for, the leader of the class or something like that, and there's a mixed gender, you will find that the boys will largely vote for boys and the girls vote more for boys than girls, because the male is the superior of the species. Now, so that's why you have to have one of each. Otherwise, you're going to have male hegemony writ large everywhere. So I think that is a major problem, because dominance is a very dangerous attribute, because, first of all, none of us can be dominant all the time. And subordinacy is endemic to the human condition as well. We're always poorer, not as good looking, not as smart, not as successful as somebody else. And so I think that caring is written out of masculinity. To be a man is not to be caring. As you know, what we found in Affective Equality book and the interviews with men who were carers, they were very happy to be carers, provided they had some other identity. Farmer, part-time, minding their mother or mind their wives, or they had some other job. But they didn't I don't think any of those who interviewed defined themselves solely as a carer. Because to me, a man mustn't do that kind of work. And I'll go back to what I said earlier. It's not seen as citizenship defining work. So we have to get away from this idea that to do care work is not seen as citizenship defining. Even our attitude to people who do manual work really annoys me. Because the people who produce food for us, farmers in particular, and people who do manual labor, I have the greatest respect because they produce life. They produce the food we eat. They produce that without which we could not survive. But yet we tend to denigrate that as if that kind of work was of lesser importance than some kind of academic work. And one of the reasons people don't want to do certain jobs is they don't feel respected. And I think it's because we have a very urbanized society, and a lot of people who lived in that urban culture have no history or experience of doing manual work and no importance of manual work. The manual work of caring, as you look after somebody who's in bed, you're lifting them, you're cleaning them, you're turning them, you're washing them. It's a lot of manual work. Equally, to produce food, you can't produce food. The earth itself has to be toiled and indeed often by hand if you don't have all the modern technology, if you're not a big producer. And that is part of the way in which, a lot of other things can go wrong in society. People, manual workers, and that we know are vote much more conservatively now, and the rise of the right in America, etc. And it's because people don't respect people who do the very important work.
Thank you so much for those insights. And given that, our population of interest is carers who also work, what would your final message be for the stakeholders who can effect change in the lives of this group? So this would be groups like their employers, government officials, different non-for-profits. What can they do to, restore the centrality of care and to support working family carers?
I suppose it's about a mindset within employment. I think just as you might have if you have an equality group, equality and diversity, the diversity has to include carers. They are a major part of the diversity. And it's not the same as gender. Men are carers as well. And, I know I say the majority of men don't do the hands-on work, but there are men in employment who are carers. So I think you need to have care included as a core principle of your organization you adhere to, and recognizing the fact that your employees are one form or other often carers. And I think that's very fundamental. And then that feeds down into other areas of life. And again, if you want any of these principles to be addressed and to be followed, you have to have somebody in a senior position in your business or organization who's going to be, the sponsor for this project and who's going to see it through. Because again, if somebody isn't responsible for it, if somebody doesn't make sure, and I'd say about any other equality principle, if you have nothing at the moment, you need to set up targets, timescales, and some kinds of monitoring of those, and also for your own organization and maybe for outside organizations, sanctions if they don't meet those. But without targets, timescales, monitoring, and some kind of reward or sanction, hopefully reward, it won't happen. But also how work is organized, which is a different issue. A lot of low-wage workers and even not so low-wage workers are in highly casualized employment, unpredictable hours, zero contract, etc. And, for example, like in this country, you can be forced to work overtime at no notice and required to do so. You can't do that if you're a carer. You just can't. So I think that precarious work is very, very difficult for carers because you can't plan. Whatever else you say about doing care work at home, if you're a family carer, you have to plan in advance. You can't leave somebody who is, incontinent in a bed overnight on their own. So those kind of work arrangements, what I would call precarious work, where you can't predict your hours, 0 hours contract, where you can be called in, where you can be required to do overtime. And often it's not overtime. I know in the white collar sector, the overtime is not ever stated. It's not called overtime. It's just that you're given a project that you can't do within the hours that are within the day. So effectively, you're expected to do it in the evening, at night, in the morning, or some other time. So I think all those work arrangements that assume that people are these detached, independent workers, I think that needs to change. We need to think of our employees relationally And what relational commitments have they in this? If they're young, if they're small children, the children are going to get sick, they're going to have to get days off work. Those are the realities. And if you don't address those, then you have a lot of people who will go sick because they have no other means of taking time off work if they have the care responsibilities.
Thank you so much. Do you have any final comments?
You're very welcome, Doreen. It was a pleasure talking to you.
We've reached the end of our Carewell conversation for this episode. I'd like to thank you for listening. If you'd like to hear more from us, please subscribe to Carewell Conversations on your podcast platform of choice, or alternatively, you will find us at carewellproject.com or across our various social media channels, which are linked in our podcast feed. We'd also like to hear from you, our listeners. Please feel free to leave any comments, feedback, or suggestions you may have on any of our social media feeds, or you can contact us directly at carewell@ucd.ie. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to you joining us on future Carewell Conversations.